Hey everyone, my name is Anchovies and welcome to the Lyney Guide. In this video, we are going to be going over everything regarding Lyney, regarding his kit, constellations, builds, and more. Without further ado, let's just go ahead and get on into it. So let's first start with his role in the game. So Lyney is an on-field charge attack DPS. He's based around dealing damage through his charge shots, as well as following up with his elemental burst and elemental skill. Taking a peek at his kit, let's start with his normal attack talent. The main thing to take into account with this talent is his charge shot. So he has a 2-level charge shot, the level 1 just shooting a regular Pyro arrow, while the level 2 charge shot fires a prop arrow that deals Pyro damage and summons a Grindmalkin hat. If he is above 60% of his max HP, then he will consume a certain percentage of HP to gain 1 prop surplus stack. He can have up to 5 stacks, and these stacks will expire after 30 seconds out of combat. Now with the Grindmalkin hat, this hat can taunt enemies, and it has a 5-second cooldown for each enemy that is taunted, and it has a 4-second base duration. This will inherit some of Lyney's max HP, and if it is destroyed or expires, it will fire off a pyrotechnic strike at nearby enemies, dealing pyro damage. Only one hat can be on the field at the same time. And after Lyney fires off a prop arrow, he will deal Numa aligned damage in the form of a Spirit Breath Thorn. When you cast Lyney's elemental skill, it will do a flourish in front of him, dealing AoE pyro damage. Now this ability is directional, meaning that it will deal damage based on the direction that Lyney, the character model, is facing. This will consume all prop surplus stacks, so the more stacks that you have, the more damage and self-healing that he will get. Note that you will need at least 1 stack to be able to heal. If you cast his elemental skill while there are Grindmalkin hats on the field, then they will explode on cast, dealing AoE pyro damage that is equivalent to a pyrotechnic strike, and this is considered charge attack damage. His elemental skill has a 15-second cooldown, meaning that generally you do want to use this towards the end of rotations. Casting his elemental burst turns him into a Grindmalkin cat. He will gain increased damage reduction while he is in this state. This will deal an instance of pyro damage to each enemy that is hit along the path, and when it ends, Lyney will dismiss and deal AoE pyro damage. Now after he dismisses and deals his damage, he will summon a Grindmalkin hat and also gain 1 prop surplus stack. Do know that you can cancel this ability actively by pressing the elemental skill button during the animation. His Grindmalkin cat state has a 3-second duration, with a 15-second cooldown on his burst and a 60 energy cost. For talent priorities, you mainly want to level his normal attack talent, as that is where the majority of his damage is coming from. However, he also does a decent amount of damage through his elemental skill and his elemental burst, so after his normal attack talent, you can level those up next. Transitioning over to passive effects, for his Ascension 1 passive, if Lyney consumes HP while firing a prop arrow, he will restore 3 energy to himself when a hat summoned does hit an enemy. Additionally, the damage dealt by this is also increased by 80% of his attack, so this gives him some energy alleviation while dealing some extra damage. For his Ascension 4 passive, the damage that he deals is increased on enemies that are affected by Pyro. At base, this is a 60% damage bonus, and for each additional Pyro member, this will increase by 20%. So if you have 2 Pyro members including Lyney, then you'll get 80% damage bonus. If you have 3 Pyro members in total, you'll have a 100% damage bonus, and 100% is the max, meaning that triple Pyro teams, so things like Mono Pyro, are especially where he will be able to maximize this passive effect. And because of the fact that this only works on enemies that are affected by Pyro, this strongly incentivizes Mono Pyro teams with lots of Pyro application on enemies. And for his exploration passive, he locates resources that are unique to Fontaine on the minimap, which makes him a go-to for exploration and farming when you are exploring Fontaine. For teams and synergies, generally one of his main team archetypes is of course Mono Pyro. You can do things like double Pyro with Lyney, Bennett, and Animo in flex slot. You can do things like triple Pyro with 3 Pyro including Lyney, Bennett, and a Pyro flex, and then a flex slot in the last spot. He can also be played in Farina teams where you use like him, Bennett, Farina, and Kazuha. This is especially a really effective team, and while of course the Ascension 4 passive may not be as consistent, the damage increase from Farina and the vape damage makes up for it in most cases, so this is fine. He can also be played in Chevreuse Overload teams with himself, Chevreuse. Typically you can use Bennett if you want to, although you do have the option not to, but it's generally recommended to because of how much Bennett benefits Lyney. And then of course at least 1 Electro person to trigger Overload. For combos and rotations, so his most general rotation is doing a series of charge shots. In most rotations you can get off around 3 charge shots. There are a few rotations where you can get 4 off if you're lucky, but if you're not like in a shield team where you don't have any defensive utility, it can be kind of hard to get 4 off, so generally 3 is like a good general assumption. Then you cast his elemental burst, then his skill, and then if you want to, you can end it by doing another charge shot to stack early, so that way in the next rotation you can maybe more easily get 5 stacks from just doing 3 charge shots. Let's now transition into Constellations. So let's start with this Constellation 1. So this makes it to where he can have 2 Grandmalkin hats at one time on the field, and prop arrows will summon 2 hats and grant an extra prop surplus stack, and this effect has a 15-second cooldown. So generally speaking, when you have 2 hats on the field, especially when you cast his elemental skill with both hats on the field, it will do a lot of additional damage, and also having 2 hats in that extra prop surplus stack makes it to where even if you're only doing like 2 or 3 charge shots, you'll still be able to either get equivalent damage to as you were doing C0 combos, or you can even easily get 5 stacks in most rotations. And this does give a slight DPS increase of around 9% for him. For a second constellation, he will gain crisp focus stacks every 2 seconds that he is on the field, and each stack increases his crit damage by 20%. He can have up to 3 stacks or 60% crit damage, and this will cancel when Lyney is off the field. So this extra crit damage is really nice, especially if you already have a well-optimized Marchesi Hunter build or just a well-built build in general, where he has a decent amount of crit rate. The extra crit damage will be able to make crit hits feel a lot more powerful, and because of this actually translates to around a 15% damage increase for Lyney. His C3 is actually pretty good because it increases his normal attack talent level by 3, and because that is where the majority of his damage is coming from, this does actually translate to around a 10 to 12% DPS increase, which makes it actually pretty nice. His C4 decreases the pyro resistance of enemies by 20% for 6 seconds whenever enemies are hit by his pyro charge shots. The resistance shred is both good for himself but also for other teammates, especially if you're running him in like a triple pyro team with Xiangling especially. That extra pyro resistance decrease is going to also increase pyro damage from other teammates, which while for himself is around an 8 to 10% DPS increase, can be a notable team DPS increase as well in those scenarios. His C5 increases his elemental burst talent level by 3. Although his burst does a decent amount of damage in rotations, it's not significant as like his normal attack talent, so this only really translates to around like a 3% DPS increase. And then for his C6, so after he fires a prop arrow, he will fire a pyrotechnic strike reprised that deals 80% of pyrotechnic strike's damage. And this is of course considered charge attack damage. Now this additional instance of damage is quite a bit, and so this translates to around a 18 to 24% DPS increase. Now specifically in the context of something like Farina Vape teams, this is closer to 10%, and of course the context is if Lyney is really the only one that is C6 in this team, and this is of course due to the low Ascension 4 passive uptime, which will actually hurt him a little bit because it does make him lose out on some damage from this extra reprise damage because of the fact that you're vaping rather than hitting enemies that are affected by pyro most of the time. So as far as I have observed, it does seem like this constellation is a lot more powerful in mono pyro teams rather than in these Farina Vape teams. So let's now cover some general pros and cons about Lyney. So let's start with the pros. And the first one is being that he just does a lot of damage in quick succession. You do a couple of charge shots, you do his burst, and then you do his elemental skill, and it's a lot of damage, and his rotations are relatively short. Generally, he prefers 15-second rotations, although there are some cases where it can extend to 16 or 18 or 20 depending on support characters. But just him by himself can deal a lot of damage in really quick succession, and that is really nice, especially for people who are doing things like speedrun content. I think they especially find value in just being able to do a lot of damage in really quick succession. Another thing is that he's actually relatively easy to build and quite free-to-play friendly. You have a lot of free-to-play weapons, like you have Song of Steelness, you also have Star Glitter to get the Warbow, you also have Prototype Crescent if you're not in Fontaine yet. He has a decent selection of free-to-play options, and his free-to-play options are actually relatively good, especially Song of Stillness at high refinements, really competitive and quite nice. And truthfully speaking, you can just put him on 2-piece and he'll actually be pretty good on that, but you can also just slot him with 4-piece Marchesi Hunter, which is a straightforward domain to get and is a very resin efficient domain. Now despite having some constraints with team archetype situations because of the fact of his Ascension 4 passive making him a little bit limited to mono pyro, he actually does have a decent variety of teammate selection within these archetypes. You can do like double Geo, you can do Animo flexes and Geo flexes, you have the option of doing a triple pyro setup, and you can even opt for more defensive setups with things like Yanfei or like Dehya. He actually has a decent amount of flexibility with which teammates he can use, and he'll still work fine. As a C0 Fontaine DPS, he is of course really strong and honestly an entire unit at C0 and performs in his niche quite well. Also scales well with investment if you plan on getting like C1, C2. I think that overall, and on top of that even like his weapon, he's pretty good for people who want to vertically invest in him specifically. So now let's get into some of the downsides. So one of the main downsides is, of course, he's kind of stuck in a team archetype. More specifically, the fact that he's very hip to hip with Bennett because of how well Bennett works with him, because of the flat attack buff, but also because of the fact that Bennett heals. And so this allows Lyney to activate the 4-piece Marchesi Hunter passive effect very easily. And while some people don't mind this, a lot of people are tired of seeing Bennett with every single attack scaling unit, so this can be boring to some people. The next thing is that, well, he is a charge shot character, and Ganyu is infamous for this point because of the fact that people are not very fond of charge shot gameplay. And Lyney is a charge shot character, so if you do not find that fun or exciting, probably not the character for you. And an additional point for the fact that having no shield or form of interruption resistance will definitely feel painful unless you have good mechanics or understanding of the game. Having no shield or interruption resistance on charge shot characters and being a typical casual player or just somebody who doesn't care too much about learning the mechanics of the game can feel somewhat stressful when you're trying to play it, especially when you're just trying to do typical abyss clears, can feel quite annoying. And additionally, he loses a lot of power when he is against things like elementally infused enemies. Now, of course, this does not mean that he cannot clear against these enemies. It's just more so the fact that his Ascension 4 passive just will rarely ever activate, it never activates basically. And so he loses out on a decent amount of damage because of that. Now let's move on to artifacts. So starting with artifact sets. So the main one in go-to is Marchesi Hunter. He's able to benefit from the 2-piece effect and the 4-piece effect because of his HP drain and gain through his charge shots and his elemental skill, along with the fact that he's typically played with Bennett, so he can very easily get 3 stacks and maintain 3 stacks throughout rotations. Next up is 4-piece Lava Walker, especially in Mono Pyro teams specifically. Next is 4-piece Vermilion or Shimenawa's Reminiscence. Now, let's discuss. Shimenawa's will be able to outperform Lava Walker in the context of if you're opting to burst every other rotation. And in these rotations, you typically want to start with his elemental skill. Now, if you're using something like Vermilion hereafter, it will also be somewhat comparable to Lava Walker, although not as strong as, say, Shimenawa's in some cases. And with this set, you want to start with his Elemental Burst because of the way that the 4-piece passive effect works. However, in my opinion, I would not say you should immediately opt to get Shimenawa's or Vermilion. And that's because of the fact that although his burst does not do as much damage as his normal attacks, and same thing regarding his elemental skill, they still do a significant amount of damage to the point where it's somewhat worth investing into. So because of that, I'd rather you use something like Marchesi Hunter or Lava Walker in Mono Pyro teams, but they are an option nonetheless if you want to use them. And then lastly is of course 2-piece variations with things like attack percent and then pyro damage or Marchesi Hunter. And honestly, these 2 pieces actually perform almost near equivalently with some of these other pieces, excluding Marchesi Hunter. And even then, if you have a really good 2-piece with amazing substats, it can actually be quite competitive. For main stats, generally you want attack percent sands, a pyro damage goblet or an attack goblet if you don't have a good pyro damage goblet, and a crit circlet. For substats, prioritize crit, then attack percent or flat attack, and some additional energy recharge would not hurt to have on Lyney. Let's now cover his best weapons. So starting with his 5-star weapons, we of course have his signature weapon, the First Great Magic. This offers crit damage and a decent base attack stat, along with a charge attack damage increase. And this weapon is especially strongest in teams where there are 2 or 3 power members in the team, including Lyney. His next best option in the 5-star department and just in general is Aqua Simulacra. Offers a lot of crit damage with a lower base attack stat. However, with the passive effect, you do have to be relatively close to enemies to benefit from it, which means that this does work a little better in things like shielded teams, and if you're running non-shield teams, then it can be a little bit annoying. Thundering Pulse is the next one, as it's again another crit damage weapon, provides some attack percent at base in the passive, but he will not benefit from the rest of the passive effect because he doesn't do normal attack damage. He is a charge attack damage character. Next up is Skyward Harp or Amos's Bow. These are decent options if you just don't have the aforementioned 5-star weapons. Now for Polar Star in Hunter's Path, these are crit rate weapons, and especially if you're using 4-piece Marchesi Hunter, you're going to very easily overcap on crit rate because Lyney ascends with crit rate, Marchesi Hunter gives up to 36% crit rate, and you're getting the crit rate from the weapons. You're more than likely going to overcap on crit rate. Now for Hunter's Path, this one is just completely a no in my book, especially because of the fact that the passive is pretty useless on Lyney because he does not build elemental mastery whatsoever. For Polar Star, now this one I actually don't mind as much, mainly because first it offers a skill and burst damage increase, which is pretty nice for Lyney and gives him some extra chip damage. However, with this weapon, it is somewhat recommended to start with a normal attack at either the start or before you're doing your charge shots, so that way you can get an extra stack from the passive effect. And whether your charge shots benefit from 2 or 3 stacks simply depends on the scenario. Typically, you can benefit from 3 stacks for your charge shot if you're using something like Shimenawa's, where you're starting with his elemental skill or you're opening with his burst every rotation. Cases where you often stick with just 2 stacks is just if you're just not bursting at the start of rotations, or you're not using Shimanawas and starting with his elemental skill at the start. For 4 stars, typically speaking, Scion of the Blazing Sun is a go-to option if you're a battle pass user. It has a low crit rate stat that makes overcapping on crit rate less of an issue and offers a lot of base attack. It provides increased charge attack damage and can actually be somewhat competitive with non-crit damage 5-star weapons at higher refinements. Song of Stillness is another amazing 4-star option and generally his best free-to-play option. Very consistent damage and can easily proc the passive effect, especially when you're using a character like Bennett with him. Prototype Crescent is also a decent free-to-play option, especially pre-Fontaine. However, the power of this weapon falls dramatically if you do not hit weak points, which in a lot of cases you probably won't, unless you're fighting a boss enemy. And even then, hitting weak points is relatively inconsistent in most gameplay, so Prototype Crescent is not necessarily as strong as it may appear. And then of course you can also get Blackcliff Warbow with Star Glitter. It's a decent crit damage stat stick, however the passive effect is quite context dependent, which makes it relatively inconsistent, and also it, well, costs Star Glitter, ew. And on top of that, you can literally craft a highly refined Song of Stillness that is both cheaper and more consistent results. Alright, and that is going to conclude this Lyney guide. Thank you so much for watching this. If you did enjoy it, then be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below for more Genshin Impact content. The next video will be an Arlecchino guide, so stay tuned for that. And until the next video, bye bye.